Detachment can look like maturity, but sometimes it's camouflage. Camouflage from being affected. Camouflage from being exposed. Camouflage from needing anything at all. You tell yourself you're simply calmer now. Less reactive. Less entangled. Less dependent on emotional intensity. And in many ways, that's true. But something else has shifted. You no longer enter conversations the same way. You don't rush to explain yourself. You don't feel compelled to regulate tension that isn't yours. Conflict doesn't hook you. Silence doesn't unsettle you. Distance doesn't scare you. You are present, yet slightly removed. At first, this feels like strength, like finally stepping out of old patterns, like no longer being pulled into emotional gravity that once controlled you. But Jung observed something subtle about this stage of psychological development. After shadow integration, after projection weakens, after unconscious participation decreases, a specific form of detachment emerges. Not coldness, not apathy, but a quiet reduction in emotional involvement. And this is where the danger begins, because when you stop being pulled, you also risk stopping yourself from being moved. The Sophia Stage is often described as dangerous wisdom, but it also carries something quieter, dangerous detachment. And detachment, when it becomes camouflage, doesn't feel dramatic. It feels justified. If detachment becomes camouflage, it doesn't announce itself. It feels reasonable. You tell yourself you are simply no longer overextending. You don't step into every emotional tension. You don't rush to repair every misunderstanding. You don't feel compelled to fill silence. You notice something else too. You are no longer emotionally pulled. Where you once leaned forward, you now remain still. Where you once explained, you now observe. Where you once absorbed, you now allow. Nothing dramatic has happened. You haven't withdrawn affection. You haven't grown indifferent. But you are no longer entering the same way. And entry matters. For a long time, connection was built on subtle participation, on micro-adjustments, on anticipation, on emotional responsiveness that felt natural. You didn't call it effort. You called it closeness. But something shifted. You are still present, yet you no longer complete certain emotional movements automatically. The conversation reaches a pause, and you let it remain. Someone expresses tension, and you don't rush to soften it. A familiar dynamic begins to unfold, and you don't step into your old position. At first, this feels like strength, like finally stepping out of unconscious patterns. And in many ways, it is. But every relational system has gravity, and gravity depends on participation. When participation decreases, the system doesn't collapse loudly. It recalibrates quietly, and sometimes it begins to thin. Jung observed something subtle about psychological development. He noticed that as people moved deeper into individuation, their relationship to emotional gravity began to change. Not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally. They were still capable of feeling, still capable of love, still capable of intensity. But they were no longer unconsciously organized around it. They did not enter every emotional field automatically. They could see it. They could understand it. But they were no longer absorbed by it. And this distinction is small, but decisive. Most relationships rely on unconscious participation, not manipulation, not control. Participation. A silent rhythm forms over time. One person anticipates, the other relaxes. One absorbs tension, the other stabilizes. One explains, the other releases. These movements are rarely discussed. They feel natural. But when individuation progresses, something begins to loosen. Projection weakens. Emotional hooks lose their force. The nervous system stops bracing. You no longer feel responsible for completing emotional circuits that are not yours. And this is where detachment emerges. Not as withdrawal, but as reduction. Reduction in reflex. Reduction in compensation. Reduction in unconscious agreement. From the inside, it feels like clarity. From the outside, it can feel like distance. Jung did not describe this as pathology. He described it as consequence. When projection dissolves, participation shifts. And when participation shifts, relational gravity changes. This is not about becoming colder. It is about no longer entering dynamics automatically. But here is where the quiet tension begins to build. Because systems that were stabilized by your participation will feel the absence, not consciously, but instinctively. The rhythm slows. The familiar completion doesn't happen. The circuit remains open. And when circuits remain open long enough, something begins to thin. Not through conflict, through silence. Isolation rarely begins with a decision. It begins with a reduction. You stop entering emotional currents automatically, and nothing dramatic happens. No argument marks the shift. No conversation defines it, but the atmosphere changes. You notice it first in small moments. A conversation that once flowed effortlessly now reaches quiet pauses you don't feel compelled to fill. Someone shares something heavy, and you don't instinctively lean in to absorb it. A tension rises in a room, and you don't move to soften it. You remain present, but you remain contained. From the inside, this feels stable. From the outside, it can feel unfamiliar. For a long time, connection was organized around responsiveness. Your subtle adjustments kept emotional exchanges moving. You asked the extra question. You softened the tone. You carried the undercurrent. Now you allow the undercurrent to surface on its own. And when no one steps in to stabilize it, the rhythm slows. At first, people don't know what they are reacting to. They just feel something different. Less emotional cushioning. Less immediate reassurance. Less invisible support. And because the shift is subtle, it rarely becomes explicit. Instead, communication thins. Messages become shorter. Conversations become more functional. Shade intensity decreases. Nothing is wrong, but something is missing. It's similar to stepping back from a fire that once required constant tending. For years, you kept adding wood. You adjusted the flames so they wouldn't burn too high. You made sure warmth remained. Then one day, you stepped back. Not angrily, not resentfully, simply because you no longer feel compelled to manage the heat. The fire doesn't go out immediately. It just burns differently. And if no one else adds wood, it slowly dims. Isolation in this stage does not feel like rejection. It feels like quiet space. But space, if left unexamined, accumulates. Jung noticed that as individuation deepens, individuals often report a strange shift in relational gravity. Not because they want distance, but because they no longer participate unconsciously. And unconscious participation is often what keeps intimacy dense. When you stop anticipating, others must begin anticipating. When you stop absorbing, others must begin regulating themselves. When you stop completing emotional circuits, others must sit with the open loop. Some people adapt. They recalibrate. They begin carrying their own weight. But many do not notice the shift consciously. They only feel the absence. And absence is often misinterpreted as withdrawal. You may hear phrases like, "You feel different lately. You seem farther away. You're not as expressive." But what changed was not affection. It was participation. You are no longer leaning forward into every exchange. And leaning forward used to be the invisible glue. Subtle isolation doesn't announce itself as loneliness. It feels more like neutrality, a growing sense that you are surrounded, but not entirely reached. You sit in conversations and notice you are observing more than entering. You understand dynamics clearly, but you don't feel compelled to intervene. There is less friction, but also less intensity. And here lies the quiet danger. When intensity drops, connection can either deepen or thin. If depth replaces intensity, detachment matures. If nothing replaces intensity, distance grows. And distance, when gradual, can go unnoticed for a long time. Until one day, you realize you didn't lose people loudly. You lost them quietly. But isolation is only the surface expression. The deeper shift happens more quietly. When participation decreases in relationships, something else begins to reorganize internally. You are no longer pulled into emotional currents. And at first, that feels stabilizing. You sleep better. You overthink less. You don't replay conversations the same way. You feel less affected. And that feels like progress. But over time, a subtler question begins to form. If you are no longer pulled, are you still entering? There is a difference between not being consumed and not being touched. You may notice moments where something meaningful happens. A confession, a disagreement, a moment of affection, and instead of feeling stirred, you remain composed, not numb, just steady. You tell yourself this is maturity, and often it is. But detachment has two faces. One is regulation. The other is insulation. Regulation allows you to feel without losing yourself. Insulation prevents you from feeling deeply at all. The difference is not obvious from the outside. Both look calm. Both look centered. But internally, one remains open. The other quietly closes. Jung noticed that as psychological strength increases, the ego becomes more self-contained, less reactive, less dependent, less entangled. This is necessary for individuation. But strength, if left unexamined, can harden. When you learn that remaining composed keeps you safe, you may begin to choose composure automatically. When you discover that not attaching prevents pain, you may begin to avoid attachment altogether. Not consciously, just subtly. You stop leaning in. You stop exposing your need. You stop allowing yourself to be visibly moved. You are still kind, still present, but harder to reach. And here the danger deepens. Because if nothing hooks you anymore, nothing can destabilize you. But nothing can fully awaken you either. Detachment, when it becomes armor, doesn't feel defensive. It feels efficient. You conserve energy. You avoid unnecessary friction. You protect your stability. But stability without vulnerability can quietly turn into distance from life itself. And that shift is almost impossible to detect. Until someone says, you feel different. Not colder. Not cruel. Just less available. And sometimes, you realize they are right. There is a stage in detachment that feels almost liberating. You are no longer chasing approval. No longer seeking validation. No longer trying to prove your worth through intensity. Romantic urgency softens. Competition loses its charge. Conflict stops feeling necessary. And for a while, this feels like freedom. You are not reactive. You are not desperate. You are not driven by insecurity. But something else begins to change. When nothing hooks you, nothing drives you either. Desire becomes quieter. Not in a dramatic way. In a gradual one. You notice you no longer crave the same closeness. You don't feel compelled to pursue. You don't feel the same spark of urgency. You are content. But the contentment has a flat edge. This is the part few people talk about. Because detachment is often celebrated as strength. And it is. But desire is not weakness. It is vitality. When emotional hooks disappear, it can be difficult to distinguish between peace and disinterest. You may tell yourself you are simply more selective now. And that may be true. But there is a difference between selectivity and disengagement. Selectivity is intentional. Disengagement is passive. One still moves toward what matters. The other slowly stops moving at all. Jung understood that individuation reduces unconscious drives, but he never suggested that it should eliminate aliveness. The goal was not emotional neutrality. It was conscious participation. When detachment matures properly, you choose what you enter. When detachment drifts, you stop entering altogether. You say you no longer need romance, but do you still allow longing? You say you no longer seek validation, but do you still allow yourself to be seen? You say you are beyond competition, but do you still pursue growth? If nothing pulls you anymore, you may begin to float, and floating feels calm, until you realize you are no longer building anything. Freedom without direction becomes drift. Drift rarely feels alarming. It feels reasonable. You wake up. You function. You move through your day with clarity. There is no chaos, no urgency, no emotional turbulence demanding your attention. But there is also no forward tension, no inner pull toward something that stretches you. You may notice it in small ways. An opportunity appears, and you feel neutral. Someone expresses interest, and you feel composed, but unmoved. A possibility opens, and you analyze it calmly, without desire. Everything is processed. Nothing is pursued. At first, this seems like mastery. You are no longer driven by insecurity, no longer chasing stimulation. But vitality is not the same as stimulation. Vitality requires exposure. It requires allowing yourself to want something enough, to risk discomfort again. If detachment removes compulsion but also removes longing, life becomes organized around maintenance rather than creation. And maintenance, while stable, does not expand you. Drift does not destroy your life. It slowly narrows it, not through collapse, but through reduction of reach. And this is why the danger is subtle. You are not falling. You are simply no longer climbing. You are no longer driven by insecurity. But you may also no longer be moved by inspiration. The nervous system has stabilized. But desire requires movement. It requires risk. It requires allowing yourself to be affected. Detachment protects you from emotional chaos. But if it also protects you from longing, from ambition, from connection, then it begins to thin the very vitality that individuation was meant to protect. The Sophia Stage is not meant to erase desire. It is meant to purify it, to remove compulsion, not to remove hunger. When hunger disappears entirely, it is worth asking why. Because the absence of desperation is healthy, but the absence of desire is not the same thing. And here, the danger reaches its quiet peak. Not isolation, not armor, but drift. A life stable on the surface, yet no longer pulled toward anything that demands courage. The danger is not detachment itself. It is unconscious detachment. There is a version of detachment that protects your alignment, and there is another that quietly reduces your aliveness. The difference is not in how calm you appear. It is in whether you can return. Return to vulnerability. Return to desire. Return to being affected by choice. Jung never suggested that individuation meant emotional withdrawal. He described it as differentiation. To differentiate is not to withdraw. It is to remain yourself while engaging. This is the subtle correction many people miss. Detachment was never meant to remove you from emotional gravity entirely. It was meant to free you from unconscious gravity. There is a difference. Unconscious gravity pulls you without awareness. You overextend. You compensate. You regulate what is not yours. Conscious gravity is different. You enter because you choose to. You lean in because something matters. You reveal yourself because intimacy requires exposure. The mature form of detachment does not eliminate emotion. It eliminates compulsion. You can feel deeply, but you are not captured. You can care intensely, but you are not destabilized. You can attach, but you are not dependent. This is warm detachment. You remain open, but not entangled. You remain steady, but not insulated. You remain independent, but not unreachable. The test of the Sophia stage is not whether you can detach. It is whether you can re-enter. Can you allow yourself to be moved again? Can you risk attachment without dissolving into it? Can you pursue something without losing yourself? If the answer is yes, detachment has matured. If the answer is no, detachment has hardened. Many people become proud of their emotional independence. They wear it like armor. They speak about not needing anyone, about being beyond validation, about having transcended attachment. But transcendence without tenderness becomes isolation. True individuation does not make you untouchable. It makes you capable of touch without losing form. This is why Jung spoke of the transcendent function, not as escape, but as integration, the ability to hold opposites, closeness and autonomy, desire and steadiness, intensity and regulation, detachment and connection. When you can move between these states consciously, you are no longer drifting. You are navigating, and navigation requires intention. If you notice that nothing pulls you anymore, ask yourself, is this peace, or have I stopped allowing myself to want? If you notice that you are no longer affected, ask yourself, is this regulation, or have I chosen insulation? These questions are not accusations. They are calibrations, because the Sophia stage is not about becoming distant. It is about becoming deliberate. Deliberate in what you enter. Deliberate in what you sustain. Deliberate in what you release. You do not have to return to old patterns. You do not have to reattach to chaos. But you also do not have to float above life to remain safe. The goal was never emotional neutrality. It was freedom from unconscious participation. Freedom allows movement. Neutrality stops it. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Detachment becomes dangerous only when you forget how to come back. The Sophia stage is often described as dangerous because of what you begin to see. But it is just as dangerous because of what you begin to stop feeling. Not pain, not chaos, but pull. The pull toward people. The pull toward intensity. The pull toward being emotionally entangled. Detachment arrives quietly. It feels earned. It feels stabilizing. And in many ways, it is. You are no longer organized around unconscious participation. You are no longer driven by projection. You are no longer compelled to regulate what does not belong to you. That is growth. But growth always removes something. And what it removes must be replaced consciously. If detachment is not followed by deliberate re-entry, it can turn into distance. If regulation is not followed by vulnerability, it can turn into insulation. If freedom from compulsion is not followed by chosen desire, it can turn into drift. This is the quiet edge of the Sophia stage. Not destruction, not collapse, but subtle reduction. Reduction of participation, reduction of intensity, reduction of movement, until one day, stability begins to resemble stillness, and stillness begins to resemble disconnection. The dangerous detachment of the Sophia stage is not about becoming cold. It is about becoming so self-contained that nothing reaches you. And when nothing reaches you, nothing reshapes you. Individuation was never meant to remove you from life. It was meant to return you to it, consciously, to allow you to enter connection without losing yourself, to allow you to feel without being captured, to allow you to desire without being driven by fear. If you can detach and still return, you are not drifting. You are choosing. If you can remain steady and still be moved, you are not insulated. You are integrated. The danger is not in detachment. It is in forgetting that detachment was only a phase, not a final position. The Sophia stage does not end in distance. It matures into discernment. You no longer enter every emotional gravity, but you do enter what matters. Not compulsively, not defensively, deliberately. And that is the difference between drifting away from life and walking through it with awareness.